Hello there. Let's read Everybody Bakes Bread. It was another rainy Saturday. Why did it always have to rain on the weekend? At least it could snow instead. We were supposed to play kickball today, but nobody would come out in all this rain. Mom was making my great-grandmother's Italian bread with me and Anthony. He's my little brother, and he was really getting on my nerves. Carrie, that is enough. Mom had that dangerous sound in her voice. But I never get a turn at kneading, I said. I kneaded Anthony's arm to make him move. He squawked and the bread dough fell on the floor. Quiet, you two, scolded Mom. Anna is sleeping. We made faces at each other while Mom sighed and stared out the window at the rain. She turned around and raised one eyebrow. Carrie, why don't you go ask Mrs. Ambrose and Crystal if they have a 3-handled rolling pin we can use? Okay, I said. I liked to run errands. I want to go too, whined Anthony. Then you'll miss the braiding and the baking, Mom reminded him. Anthony thought about it, then smiled and stuck out his tongue at me. Is the rolling pin for baking, Mom? I asked, pulling on my boots and raincoat. Just tell them what we're doing and that I need one, she said, with a funny little smile. Can I ask around the neighborhood? Just be back for lunch, said Mom. There were only a few interesting puddles on the way to Mrs. Ambrose's house, so I got there pretty quick. It took them a while to answer their door, since Mrs. Ambrose uses a cane and her cousin Crystal has a bad hip. But I didn't mind, because their entry smelled like fresh coconut bread. And next to Barbadian fish cakes, I think I like Barbadian coconut bread best. Crystal let me in, and I told her why I was there. She laughed quietly as I climbed the stairs slowly behind her. Upstairs, Mrs. Ambrose said, Sit down a moment, girl. Test some of this bread come fresh out the oven. I was right. There on the cooling rack were 2 big loaves of coconut bread. Mrs. Ambrose cut me an end piece and a puff of steam came out. The bread was heavy in my hand. It was packed with raisins and sweet with coconut. What should I tell my mom about the rolling pin? I asked between bites. Oh, tell her we loaned it to our niece, said Mrs. Ambrose. But you're welcome to come back any time your mother needs something, added Crystal sweetly. Thanks for the bread, I called as I clumped down the stairs. It was raining harder than ever when I went to Rajit's house. His mom has lots of interesting things to cook with. Besides, Rajit is a good kickball player, and if enough kids would come out, maybe we could have a rainy kickball game. Rajit's mom answered the door. Carrie, come in, come in. What brings you out in this weather? She asked. After I explained about our bread making and my errand, she said, smiling, Well, I will check for you, but I was just making chupatis, Indian bread, with Rajit and his brother. Perhaps you would like to help? We made the most delicious flatbread right in a frying pan. It was very chewy and nutty tasting. Rajit and Sanjit agreed to play kickball after lunch if I could get some other kids. Their mom couldn't find the rolling pin, so I said goodbye and went to see Mark DeLoach. I had to ring and ring before Mark heard the bell. He was listening to some loud music. What do you want? He said when he finally answered the door. I explained the game plan on our way into the kitchen. His older sisters, Anne-Marie and Shirley, were washing dishes. Mark started to pick at a pan of fresh cornbread on the table. So I did too. It tasted really buttery, and it was just plain old cornbread with nothing on it. Mrs. DeLoach comes from South Carolina, and her cornbread is the best. Anne-Marie turned around and saw us snacking. Stop picking at that. It's for the church dinner, she hollered. That's all right. Their mom came into the kitchen. This little one is just for the nibbling rabbits round here, she said. Mrs. DeLoach opened the oven and showed us a much bigger pan of cornbread inside. The big one's going to the church. But y'all, please eat like folks with manners, she said, handing us plates and a knife. Oh, I forgot to ask, I said. Have you got a 3-handled rolling pin my mom could borrow? My old pin hasn't got but 2 handles, said Mrs. DeLoach, looking at me really funny, her nose wrinkling like she had to sneeze. Y'all can ask her if she needs my 3-legged ladle, though. Anne-Marie and Shirley laughed. I did too, even though I didn't really get the joke. I'll tell her, I said as I left, and thanks for the cornbread. Nabil and his sister Amelia live with their mom, dad, and grandma above the Middle East Oasis restaurant and bakery, which their dad runs. They have lots of different stuff in the restaurant kitchen, so I thought I'd check there. Grandma Seder answered the apartment door. She's always nice to me and Anthony. Whenever she sees us pass by the restaurant, she gives us free pastries. She's from Lebanon and is very shy about speaking English, so Nabil and Amelia usually translate her Arabic for us. I asked for Nabil and Amelia with my best manners. Not here, said Mrs. Seder. Come downstairs. She pointed at a door behind me. Follow me. We went into the restaurant kitchen where everyone was busy getting ready for Saturday lunch. I looked around but didn't see any rolling pins. Nabil and Amelia were helping their uncle take balloon-shaped things out of an oven. Is this pocket bread? I asked. Yep, answered Nabil. I love the way it looks when it's puffy, I said. Nabil and I call it cloth bread when it's this fresh because it's so soft, said Amelia, as we brought a basket of bread upstairs. The bread flattened as it cooled, and it was just like a damp cloth. You could roll it or fold it or scrunch it into a ball. I told Nabil and Amelia about the kickball plan while we ate fresh bread with a thick dip called hummus. They told me to ring their bell with our special code after lunch, and they would come right down. On my way back from the Seders, I was swinging around parking meters and not really paying attention. That's how I forgot about the huge puddle where the storm sewer backs up. Look out, warned a small voice behind me. Too late. A car went zooming by, and water splashed right over my head. I was soaked, even in my raincoat. It was Mrs. Max who had called out. She was wet too. Come in with me, Carrie, and dry off a minute. Maybe have some tea, she suggested. I like Mrs. Max. Sometimes I help her with her grocery bags, and she gives me cups of tea in beautiful china she says came from the old country. Mrs. Max lives by herself right in front of that puddle in the old brick apartments. Mrs. Max said she was all dressed up because today was her Jewish Sabbath, and she had gone to temple. While she changed, I got a basin of hot water to soak our feet. We sat with towels on our heads and cups of tea in our laps. I like this bread, I said. This is challah, said Mrs. Max. I make a loaf every Friday. It's braided like my mom's, but yours is very yellow and nice and sweet, I said. Yes, it has a lot of eggs in it and some sugar. Would you like more tea? Asked Mrs. Max. And you still haven't told me what you were doing out on a day like today. Well, we were baking bread today. Anthony and I were fighting, so my mom asked me to run an errand for her. Say, do you have a 3-handled rolling pin? A 3-handed rolling pin? Your mother sent you for this? Mrs. Max was quiet for a moment, but her eyes were twinkling. Finally she said, How would you use that 3rd handle, do you think? I said, thinking this out. Oh, no, I groaned. Oh, yes, Mrs. Max answered. Your mother played a trick on you, perhaps. I laughed out loud. So did Mrs. Max. I felt warm again, and it was past noon. We still needed one more player for kickball, so I said thanks and left for my last stop before home. Our new neighbors upstairs are from El Salvador, and their son Bernardo is about my age. He's been watching us kids from the 2nd floor window, so I thought he might be interested in the kickball game. His little sister Becky looked out through the mail slot. She's just 2 years old and babbles nonstop in 2 languages, Spanish and English, all mixed together. She was telling me about our cat, I think. Bernardo's grandmother opened the door. She led me into the kitchen where Bernardo was eating something round and yellow with melted cheese coming out of it. "Hi," I said, kind of shyly. "Hi," he answered softly. Maybe he was shy too. "Eat?" asked his grandma as she set down a plate for me. "Thank you. What is this?" I asked, taking a big bite. "A pupusa," said Bernardo. "You like it?" asked his grandma. "Yes, thank you," I replied, popping the last bite into my mouth. "Bernardo, can you play kickball with us after lunch?" "Let me ask," he said. Bernardo talked to his grandma, and looking out at the rain, she shrugged her shoulders but said, "Sí." I said gracias, that's thanks in Spanish, and went down the back stairs to our house. When I opened our back door, the kitchen smelled great. "I got to do all the braiding myself," boasted Anthony. "Did you have a good walk?" asked Mom, busy with Anna. "Yes. No one had that rolling pin, but you can borrow Mrs. DeLoach's three-legged ladle any time you want," I said, giving her my best one eyebrow up look. Mom looked up and saw my face. "Oh, I guess you found me out." "Yep," I said, "but I also found enough kids to play kickball, so can I play if I wear boots and everything?" "Yes, you can play, but after you have lunch," said Mom. "Lunch," I said, finishing a piece of warm Italian bread dipped in olive oil and garlic. I couldn't eat another bite. Practically everybody was baking bread this morning. Now, there's Mrs. Ambrose's coconut bread, because this is the recipe section. And if you want, you can pause that to go make that bread. And Rajit and Sanjit's chupatis, and Mrs. DeLoach's cornbread, and Nabil and Amelia's pocket bread. That would be fun to try. And Mrs. Max's challah. There's the first half of it, and then here's a little more. And Bernardo's pupusas. And great-grandmother's Italian bread. All of those sound very good, don't they? I hope you enjoyed that book. Everybody Bakes Bread, because we all do bake bread, don't we? Hope you enjoyed it and that you subscribe and come back often. And if you've never made bread before, try one of those recipes or a different recipe. Bread is fun to make and it smells so good. And I'll see you next time here on Stories with Grandma.